Hello, welcome to the video. I'm going to be talking about Don't Look Up today. This isn't a review. This is me commenting on some varied perceptions of the movie as we head closer and closer to the Oscars ceremony. I'm not super invested in the Oscars, but in general, they can actually be a pretty interesting way to kind of gauge different cultural moments, right? Even though the Academy tends to be quite behind the times when it comes to just zeitgeist and cultural shifts, which we'll get into because that's kind of at the heart of the situation here. It can still be an interesting way to explore some of that stuff. And in this case, I have some pretty significant issues with the way that some of the people behind the movie seem to think that it functions and things that they think the movie says when it really doesn't. To me, this is not an important movie. This is not a movie of consequence. This is not edgy or groundbreaking. And even just on the baseline level of entertainment, I don't think it's very good. Okay, let's be specific. Let's get into this. So, if you're not aware of the premise of Don't Look Up, this is a movie about, some scientists. Of course, I got hair in my mouth while I'm recording. How did that, is that my hair? Some scientists find out there's a comet or an asteroid or something, and it's gonna crash into Earth and kill everything. Total extinction. And when they bring this information to the US federal government, specifically the Office of the President, they're just disregarded, right? They don't take it seriously until it's convenient for them to take it seriously. And from there, we have some additional, more specific messaging bits about like corporations have a ton of control over our political system, and lots of politicians are corrupt. And all this stuff. Very obvious and long-time criticisms of many political systems, and yes, those are valid. And yes, saying that climate change is bad and that we need to do as much as we can to prevent it as soon as possible. Yes, I am on board with that. I am not saying that Don't Look Up has no practical utility in terms of positive cultural impact. Who knows? Maybe some people will be inspired to really get out there and speak to their political representation and say, hey, look, you got to do something. Maybe they'll try to vote in favor of legislation that really limits carbon emissions for major companies. All of that could happen. Maybe some people really dig this movie and they've been energized by it, but personally, no, this movie is not nearly as important as it seems to think it is. I want to explain why I have that viewpoint. And in the process, who knows, maybe I'll end up explaining some pieces of this viewpoint that you happen to agree with. Very first thing, when it comes to a charitable cause, a major social issue or something, there are different stages to activism relevant to that issue. And typically, the very first stage is raising awareness. That's one of the first things you got to do. Is if not many people are aware of the problem, you have to make them aware. You have to bring it to their attention. They'll take it seriously, and then maybe they'll be motivated to contribute to the next phases, which are like actual action, and organization and doing real world practical things to combat the problem. And for some reason, a very large portion of Hollywood still seems to believe that for plenty of social issues and world issues that we're still in the raising awareness phase, and that will always be in that phase, because this movie especially, the fact that it got a nomination for Best Picture, okay, we'll talk a little bit about the Academy later on if I remember, but it's so clear in the way that it's written and in the way that it's being promoted currently, especially here in LA. My God, the marketing for this thing. It's clear that somebody really thinks, it might be Adam McKay himself, this is a really important movie, when as far as I can tell, it's still on the raising awareness phase. And you can argue relevant to different, social issues and stuff that unfortunately we're still in the raising awareness stage. That certainly seems to be the case with even just the naming of the Black Lives Matter movement. Yes, it's very basic on purpose because unfortunately this very basic concept of universal human dignity is not shared by tons of people. And so that's the idea. You hammer someone over the head with this really core concept and then you can move forward from there. To be clear, as far as I can see, that is not where we are with climate change at all. I don't know anyone living who hasn't at least heard of climate change, sure, they might be upset. They might think that, oh, these aren't the real facts, or like maybe humans aren't the cause of climate change. The subject in general, basically everybody on the planet is aware. We got it. Certainly here in the US, like, yes, we've been talking about this for many years now. If Don't Look Up had come out in like 2007, then maybe you could make an argument that it's doing some kind of important work because it is contributing directly to that phase of raising awareness. If it came out in the 90s, you could absolutely make the case that it was bringing it to people's attention and that was a net positive culturally in terms of the whole of the society. No, it came out in 2021, man. Like, we're past this. We're on to the part where we actually need to do things, especially at the level of federal regulation, potentially international regulation, massive companies, and really need to be reined in with all this different stuff. We're at that stage of taking action, not on the level of like, oh, use your canvas bags at the grocery store. We're at the point where there need to be massive system-wide changes, and Don't Look Up doesn't really get to that at all. Like, it's not relevant to that part of the process, in my opinion, even a little bit. And now I want to switch to talking about the satire element here. And satire on its own is actually a really fascinating concept, and it's something that's way too large and varied and complex for me to, get into in detail right now. But at a basic level, there's this idea that I've been trying to find ways to communicate, and it's about how subtle or how extreme your satire is. I think that satire can function very well if it's subtle. It can also function very well if it's more extreme in a general sense. But depending on which of those routes you choose for your piece of satire, the other choices you make have to support that choice. It's clear, as I mentioned earlier, even if just from the premise, it is so clear what this movie is trying to say. And honestly, having watched it myself, even if you don't watch it, but you just watch the trailer or something, you get an idea of what it's about, you have all of the messaging that the movie has to offer, more or less. It's really not much more than that. It's being obvious on purpose. It's being very blunt about what it's trying to say, and that's just fine. It doesn't have to be some very subtle, detailed thing beautifully executed. No, that's fine. You can be as blunt as you want to be. But in this case, only the messaging felt blunt. I didn't feel like the characters were like exaggerated enough to fit that at all, or the writing in general. It doesn't all do the job that it's trying to do. And a point of comparison I can bring up here is caricature drawing. There are different levels of remove from reality, and you can use those exaggerated elements of the real world to accomplish different things. And a caricature drawing is a very basic example of that. It's based on something from the real world, but whereas, a realistic interpretation that says basically nothing would just be like a photorealist sketch, a caricature exaggerates and heightens certain traits, makes it unrealistic, but for the purpose of comedy, being more memorable, all these different effects that can be achieved by doing that. Don't Look Up tries to be exaggerated and obvious in its messaging, but everything else just feels so similar to reality that it's not enough. It's not enough to even really qualify as satire. If you just told me that this was like a straight down the middle retelling of a real world event, I would believe you. Like, it's not that far off from what we have right now. Nowadays, where so many elements of reality, especially politics here in the US, have gone so far beyond the typical, have gone so far beyond the previous status quos, they're already doing the cartoony stuff themselves. So when satire feels like it hits the same tone and the same level of zaniness as real life, it's not gonna feel like an exaggeration at all. And meanwhile, if we try to compare this to different pieces of media that I would consider to be really successful satire, the importance of this element is really clear. So okay, one of the most famous examples ever, Jonathan Swift, A Modest Proposal. The full title is A Modest Proposal for Preventing the Children of Poor People from Being a Burden to Their Parents or Country and for Making Them Beneficial to the Public. So if you're not aware, Ireland was having some really difficult economic times in the early part of the 18th century. There was a lot of discourse, and there were some very blasé attempts to just say, like, you know what, the poor aren't actually that important. Let's disregard their needs. It's a very basic breakdown, but bear with me here. And in this piece, Jonathan Swift satires that attitude by saying, you know what, poor people should just be able to sell their children. to rich folks, and then the rich folks can do whatever they want with them. They can eat them, they can put them to work, all this kind of stuff. It's so obvious that it's an extreme exaggeration. It's taking the real life situation and real life attitudes and making them absurd. It heads towards absurdism. And for that reason, I think that it works. It works. It brings her, it's like, you know what? Actually, hold on. No, like everybody has dignity. Like we actually need to consider how we bring everybody through the situation, not just the elite, not just the rich folks. Another example, have you ever seen Solo? Let me get the full title. Solo, or the 120 Days of Sodom, partially based on a Marquis de Sade thing. Don't watch it. Not a fun time. But basically, as far as I understand, this piece was meant to be a critique of elite Italian folks, and at the time, some fascist folks. It was an anti-fascist film. It satirizes those real life people by exaggerating everything, saying that they just like torture people, treat them horribly, they don't care about other people at all, they don't care about the average citizen of Italy, all this kind of stuff. That works. It does its job. It turns heads. It's being extreme enough, it's being edgy enough to actually, get people thinking about the subject at hand. There's so many of these. They're just, in my mind, if satire isn't trying to be overly subtle, then this is the way to go. Amp things up as much as possible, and you're going to have a much better chance of achieving some kind of success. Does Don't Look Up do any of that? No. As I said earlier, it really just feels like it could be a pretty basic retelling of like, oh yeah, this is based on true events, whatever. Like those movies that they made after the fact about the, the housing crisis and the Great Recession of 2007, 2008. If you ever seen those kinds of movies where like, okay, it's a movie adaptation of the real world events, so things are slightly heightened, but more or less it's supposed to be pretty accurate to the actual events. That's what Don't Look Up feels like to me. It absolutely doesn't go far enough, and as a result, it comes across as weak. Now, some brief slamming of the Academy. There's some potential generational differences on how we view this movie. And the average age of the Academy is not 25, I'll put it that way. Older folks, compared to my age, compared to a lot of people who watch this channel, slightly older people, they probably have a different view of satire, they probably have a different view of humor, and they probably have an idea of what it means to stick it to the man. And in this case, I think a lot of younger people, myself included, look at this movie and just think, this isn't actually accomplishing anything. Like, we're so far past this. And I know that you can't generalize completely about a generation of people. We millennials know that very, very well. We've had to deal with a lot of that. But there are some commonalities, aren't there? And specifically, I think this is something that we can kind of track just with like internet discourse, internet humor specifically. Just look at the difference between like millennial internet humor and Gen Z internet humor. Like, very different, actually. Gen Z stuff tends to be much more like absurdist and loud and heavily referential. Humor is progressing. Satire will also progress as time goes on. And in this case, I just think some slightly older folks who happen to be members of the Academy who did or did not even watch their screener of the movie to begin with just said, oh, that's a movie about how climate change is bad. I support that. I want to be seen supporting that. To bring in another Oscar movie as an example, do you remember the whole thing around Green Book? I don't remember anybody talking about that movie before the Oscars, and I certainly haven't seen anybody really talking about that movie since the Oscars, outside of discussions about how it really didn't deserve all the praise it got. And I think that's a great example because, like, oh my gosh, basically everyone I spoke to who saw that movie who was over the age of 40 took it very seriously, and they were like, wow, this is how things were. Yeah, it's saying something really important. And most of the younger folks who saw it came away from it just saying like, this is painfully outdated in terms of messaging and tropes and storytelling, and it's nowhere near progressive. You could even argue that it's actually reinforcing some pretty harmful and outdated ideas. But regardless of that, Best Picture. And I'm definitely not going to be the person to tell you that varying perspectives on art or media or anything is a bad thing. No, I feel completely the opposite way. But in this case, specifically, you're setting out to make a movie that's saying, look, no joke anymore, climate change is a huge, huge deal. That is the time to go as crazy as possible. That is the time to be as edgelord as you want, to really get people's attention. This was a chance to do something relatively outlandish, and instead we get something that just feels like a forgettable TV movie, and that's such a missed opportunity in my opinion. And I think at this point I really need to stop talking because I'm so tired and I can't do it anymore. I'm starting to get worked up, if you can't tell. Anyway, those are some very general, unorganized thoughts about the situation and on why I really don't think Don't Look Up is going to continue to be consequential in any way. I don't think it's a very important movie. I don't think it had anything all that interesting to say, and I don't think it was well executed just on a level of filmmaking. There we have it. Feel free to disagree. Feel free to share your opinions on any of the many different things that I was blabbing about here, and that's all for now. Thanks for stopping by.